Der dreitägige Staatsbesuch des chinesischen Präsidenten Xi Jinping in Moskau wurde in westlichen Ländern stark kritisiert. Was ist Ihrer Meinung nach die größte Sorge der US-Regierung? Chinese President Xi Jinping's three-day state visit to Moscow was heavily criticized in Western countries. What do you think is the biggest concern of the US government?
You remember when Joseph Biden met with Vladimir Putin in Geneva in June of 2021, he tried to drive a wedge between Russia and China. Why would he seek to do that? Because there is a absolute recognition that a Russian-Chinese partnership, friendship, would basically be something that the West could not defeat. The West is seeking to isolate both Russia and China, in terms of achieving their objectives in Ukraine and Taiwan. But if China and Russia come together, the nexus of this friendship is so strong that the United States and its allies, both in Europe and the Pacific, will not be able to overcome this. This is a strategic defeat for the hegemonic policies of Washington, D.C. So this is why they speak out against it. They've tried to drive a wedge between Putin and President Xi Jinping. They timed this announcement regarding an arrest warrant in an effort to, perhaps make Xi Jinping hesitant to come to Moscow. But I think that the pushed the Chinese leader to even more closely align himself with Vladimir Putin.
In den offiziellen Erklärungen werden hauptsächlich die vertieften wirtschaftlichen Beziehungen zwischen Russland und China hervorgehoben, aber es wird nichts über die militärische Dimension gesagt. Denken Sie, dass sich Peking in dieser Frage zurückhalten wird, wie es beispielsweise Washington fordert? The official statements mainly emphasize the deepened economic relations between Russia and China, but nothing is said about the military dimension. Do you think that Beijing will hold back on this issue, as Washington, for example, is demanding?
I don't think China cares what Washington demands. I don't think Washington's demand registers in Beijing. China will do what's best for China. And right now, what's best for China is to strengthen their cooperation with Russia. There has never been a military dimension in the modern relationship between Russia and China, not in terms of trade, etc. There is a developing military cooperation. We've seen joint maneuvers where Russian and Chinese commanders work on joint operational doctrine to increase the interoperability between their two militaries. But Russia's decision to intervene in Ukraine was made independent of China, both in terms of Chinese advice and Chinese military assistance. Russia doesn't need Chinese military assistance, and I believe Russia doesn't want Chinese military assistance. For Russia to seek military assistance from China would be an acknowledgement of Russian weakness, and I have yet to see Russian leadership, try to claim on the international stage that Russia is somehow weak and inadequate to the task of confronting Ukraine and the collective West. And two, it would strain relations. So China has been very forthcoming in its support for Russia. But, I think the Russian leadership understands, and Vladimir Putin has acknowledged this, that by intervening in Ukraine, Russia put China in a difficult position because China's whole foreign policy posture is built upon Westphalian principles of non-intervention. And so, Russia cannot push China too far. Friends don't push friends. And they don't need to. What Russia needs from China is strong diplomatic support, which they have received, and strong economic support, which they have received. Russia doesn't seek military assistance, but this is part of the Western strategy. That is to pick something that is a non-issue and make it an issue in order to, for instance, if China doesn't provide military assistance, which China never was planning to provide because Russia has never asked, then the West can say, see, we forced China to back down. And by saying that, try and drive a wedge between Russia and China, which is the whole policy of the United States, to drive a wedge between Russia and China. The policy is failing.
Großbritannien hat angekündigt, der Ukraine Munition mit abgereichertem Uran zu liefern. Was bringt das und was sind die Gefahren, die vom Einsatz solcher Munition ausgehen? Britain has announced that it will supply Ukraine with depleted uranium ammunition. What is the point and what are the dangers of using such ammunition?
My understanding is that the British are going to provide tank ammunition with a depleted uranium penetrator that is standard issue with the Challenger tank that they're talking about providing to Ukraine. The Russians have made it clear that they view any introduction of nuclear material as a provocation and escalation. The concerns of the Russians in regard to depleted uranium are related to the severe consequences, environmental consequences, and medical consequences for humans that has arisen in Kosovo and in Iraq, two places where NATO and the United States have made extensive use of depleted uranium ammunition. And the Russians have said that they don't want this introduced into Ukraine for obvious reasons. I mean, the number of of depleted uranium rounds that are being provided, if it is indeed limited to the Challenger tank, will be very small. I think Russia's position is a principled position, but Russia has also been in the escalation management business, and so I don't see Russia overreacting to this. I see them, acknowledging that this is a problem, declaring that they blame Great Britain, but in terms of using this as an excuse to retaliate against England, I don't see that happening because the scope and scale of the amount of depleted uranium being brought in is very minimal. I don't want to downplay the potential health hazards that could be brought about through the introduction of this weaponry, but it pales in comparison. For instance, with the amount of depleted uranium used by the United States in the battle for Fallujah in Iraq, or by NATO in their operations in Kosovo.
Es gibt immer mehr Stimmen aus Polen oder auch aus Ihrem Land, die von der Notwendigkeit von Boots on the Ground sprechen, also dem Einsatz von eigenen Soldaten in der Ukraine. Könnte das tatsächlich passieren und was würde das bedeuten? There are more and more voices from Poland or also from your country talking about the necessity of boots on the ground. For example, the deployment of own soldiers in Ukraine. Could that actually happen, and what would that mean?
Well, fortunately, any discussion of boots on the ground are coming from people who don't make decisions. The people who do make those decisions have made it clear that that's the last thing they want. Look, General Cavoli, the commander of U.S. forces and the Supreme Allied Commander, made some interesting observations about the Ukraine conflict and NATO in January when he spoke to a defense forum in Sweden. He said that the scope and scale of the violence taking place in Ukraine is beyond the imagination of NATO, and that NATO is not currently equipped, trained, prepared for conflict there. He pointed out that there were some 37 Ukrainian brigades engaged in combat on the front line, being chewed up in combat on the front line. The level of casualties was, again, unimaginable. What boots on the ground? The United States has what, 3 brigades in Europe? Poland has how many brigades capable of power projection? I think the number can be counted on one hand. NATO simply doesn't have the resources to deploy into the kind of meat grinder operations that are taking place in Ukraine today. So it's absurd for them to talk about it because no military officer would approve this kind of operation. Military officers don't join the military to commit suicide. They join the military to serve their countries, defend their countries by seeking to prevail on the battlefield. So anybody talking about getting NATO involved in ground operations, around combat operations in Ukraine, when NATO doesn't have the resources to do this, it's simply irresponsible rhetoric. There's no chance of NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine, none whatsoever.